Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Plastic Surgery Unfiltered. I'm your host, Dr. Armando Davila, and I'm joined with my co-host, as always, Dr. David Turr.
Hey, good morning, everybody.
So today, we're going to be talking about the evolution of breast implant size.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that is kind of evolved over time and is really misunderstood, especially by a lot of patients.
Yeah. I mean, one of the first things that I always talk about is bra size. I mean, bra sizing is what they come in with,
Sure.
I think, is the very first thing.
Right.
So how do you address that?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because that's one of the very first things I address in my consult. And I specifically tell all my patients, this is the last time we're going to talk about bra size because bra size is totally unreliable. If you go to, let's say, a Victoria's Secret, you could be one size. If you go to another store, you could be a totally different size. And so I flat out tell everybody, if I guarantee you a bra size, I'm sure to be wrong because the same person could be multiple bra sizes at different stores.
Yeah, I mean, so the international measure or the initial standard of bra sizing is kind of curious because if you want to think about the history of it, it comes back to the British Empire, okay? And essentially, for those who don't know, the way your bra size works is you essentially measure your chest size, your under bust, and that number then translates to the bra strap size, but they're not actually one-to-one. So if you're like a 28 to 30 under bust, you actually are like a 32 bra size, which is a little bit confusing. And it has to do with the fact that, a lot of the world does not use inches. They use centimeters
and metric for
everything else. So it's a little bit of a challenge. And so then you have the concept. And then in the American system, essentially, if you measure your bra, your bust, your true bust, then every additional inch of circumference that your bust adds another cup size.
Right.
Which works if you're like 23 and your breasts are exactly where they're supposed to be. And
right. But then when you add in the factor of aging and drooping and all these things,
ptosis and deflation, it starts to get a little dicey.
Yeah.
And so it becomes very difficult to sort of measure, particularly, like if you go to Victoria's Secret nowadays, they don't even measure you anymore at all. And I think that like one of the things that people do is try to measure you at least in the bra that you're currently in, but then the bra could be pat. I mean, there's all sorts of things that come into it that make it very challenging.
Well, that's, and I ask people kind of where they are now and what size they want to be, only so I have a general sense of where we're going, because it helps with the next step in the way that we end up sizing breast implants. But again, I'm very, very careful to tell people that, I have no idea what bra size you're going to be because it's so unreliable.
Right. And then there's the whole math of breast implants that have evolved as well. Again, when we talk about breast implants, we talk about things like upper pole fullness, and they send us all these studies. Like we, as the plastic surgeons, see these studies like 45%, 55%, and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
And it's sort of interesting because...
Well, explain what you mean by that when you say 45, 55.
So if you look at a breast implant, right, and that you turn it on its side, essentially how it would theoretically be in your body, breast implant makers now talk about the kind of gel shift distribution. So the way we think about it is by generation, and so you have these older fourth generation implants, less cohesive
implants.
And so they would kind of would just settle with gravity. Now they don't. They kind of stay structured and have some fullness up top. But again, it's sort of like when you're measuring someone's over bust or true bust, you're measuring at this point of maximal projection. And so that's why when you talk about it, you talk about the implant being large.
Right.
We'll get to that in a second.
Sure.
But again, tell us what you mean by large, I think.
Well, I think that there's this conception amongst patients and even probably amongst a lot of plastic surgeons that the most important number is the volume, is the number of cc's. And, certainly there are, for anybody, I guess, well, unless someone's really large, like a large person, there are large implants, right? No one would argue that like an 800 cc implant isn't a large implant. But I always say this is a large implant for you, because the way that we size it depends very much on the size of the patient and their frame. And so, I think we should probably get into a little bit about how we actually do that and how maybe that's changed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing I was kind of going for was the idea that for a given base width, which we'll come back into in a second, that the projection is ultimately what decides the largeness of the implant.
Right.
And I think that translates really well to actually bra size, because again, the projection is what sets that bust distance and therefore would increase the number.
Why don't we let's start for a second and define some of these terms, because people may not even know what that means.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So there's basically 2 dimensions to any breast implant. Every implant has a width and it has a projection,
or height,
kind of how much it sticks out. And each manufacturer has different profiles, which is sort of the ratio of those things, essentially how flat or round an implant is. And so, basically we have to pair those things with the patient to get them an appropriate result. And the combination of the width and the projection ends up giving us the volume in cc's.
Correct. And I think that this is like that famous engineering triangle, which is like fast, good, cheap, or whatever. But it's sort of like if you think about your breast implant with, you say the width of it, the projection of it, and the cc's, those things are interrelated. So, when people come into a consult and they want to pick all 3, it's like that's not really
how it works, so to speak.
Yeah, it's almost like you pick 2 and you get the third.
Right.
And the question is, which are the 2 you pick and where do you start, right? And so the reason I was talking about the strap size is I think that bra size for me is an important surrogate to the base width, right? Which is this magical number that's super important. But essentially it's the breast width equivalent of the strap size. And I think that when you're if you were a tailor or you're a bra maker, right, that strap size actually affects the width of your cup, like in a underwire, like how wide the underwire is. And that width of the underwire, if you think about it, is fundamentally the base width of a breast for the most part.
Right. Some surrogate for that.
Yeah. But like that's how we start. And so whenever there's a consultation, whenever anyone comes in for a consultation, that's like one of the first measurements we make, which is the base width.
Now, what's interesting is I think because of the availability of a lot of information now, especially, with what's been out on social media recently, is that patients come in and they say, oh, I want a however many cc implant. And what they don't understand is that volume doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot without knowing the rest of the information. What's the width? What profile is it? What manufacturer is it? How big is the person they're seeing it on? And so I think that's probably the least important measurement, so to speak.
Yeah. But I think that is a consequence of our own making.
Sure.
Sure. I find it interesting that until let's just say it, until Motiva kind of came around and came with their breast sizing charts, my own brain always sort of started with that kind of concept. And the reason is that almost all sizing charts in the US for nearly every other implant maker that's available starts in the very first column with cc's. So the way your eye is drawn to the chart is you essentially go to the cc's, and then the rest of the data kind of trickles in. And so I do think that most surgeons are still doing that. And I think that also comes from a time in the United States where there was the moratorium in the 90s, and you had saline implants and you had variable expandable implants.
Right. So you didn't really even have a fixed volume, so to speak.
Yeah,
at
exactly.
least within some range.
So some range. So people could be like, I would like this many cc's, and then you filled it to that arbitrary amount.
Actually, depending on how much you fill, it actually changes the base width or the width of the implant as well.
Sure, it changes all this stuff, which means that you had this very imprecise way of sort of dealing with implants. Because if you took a 250cc implant and filled it 300, it actually narrowed the base width, increased the projection. And so now you had a completely different implant than what was listed, even if it was a moderate plus or even if it was a...
Yeah, I mean, it's confusing. Even as a surgeon, it's not totally clear always how that's going to work out. Not that we use a lot of saline implants anymore, but...
Well, I think that's the point, that... breast augmentation was sort of this like kind of let's see what happens kind of situation. And I think it's completely changed now where there's much more precision regarding the topic to make sure that there's a good breast augmentation. And so people see a lot of bad breast augmentation in the world. And I think that's also become normalized. This idea that you see these things that they look fake, that they look a certain way, that they actually just have terrible capsular contracture, but that's what breast implants should look like, and
or do look like, and
or
for
do
most
look
people,
like,
right? Which is actually the reason that you don't know about the good ones is because you can't tell,
because
they look more natural.
You shouldn't really be able to tell.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so, so yeah, I mean, going back to the breast width or the base width of the breast, I think that is a big shift of actually even how the paperwork is being generated. So Motiva has started with their base width first.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other manufacturers also has kind of a similar sizing profile where the widths are done kind of systematically, right? Like
Yeah,
11
it's
centimeters,
yeah, natural.
11.25, 11.5, 11.75, 12. And to me, it's a lot easier to think in those terms instead of kind of random base widths. But I agree with you. I like that Motiva has introduced the implants with those base widths as the primary thing that's listed on the chart. Because that's how I was trained, and that's how I think about sizing breast implants. I've always kind of thought about it that way, and the volume came secondarily.
Yeah, I think it's just but I do think it's a more modern way of sort of approaching it. I think even with the introduction of mesh and some of these other things, even some of the additional measurements that that Motiva grants, like what we call the arc width or the distance from the point where the implant is most out to the bottom is important. That's important in lifts and things. And so you want your surgeon to be precise.
Right.
But the implant companies are not providing that precision data. And I think that's a departure. And so, whether or not Motiva has the best implants is debatable, but they certainly are making it very accessible for surgeons to kind of rewire their thinking on how to get accurate kind of measurements for people.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, especially if that's kind of the system that you use, which I think some people do, is starting with the base width and kind of going from there as the most important measurement. It is easier to do that when the implants are designed systematically that way.
Right. And in the Allergan chart, you could do the same thing. It's just that you have to skip all the data in front of it and then go to the
base width.
To the base width. and that's a problem because again,
I guess the implant width.
Well, the implant width. Sorry, but the problem is the chart is arranged by profile. So you have to go to profile first, then you can go to the base width, right? In Motiva's charts, you start with the base width, and they have all the profiles
listed all together.
Right. And so it's all standardized under one. And this is a consequence of how companies manufacture. Mentor manufactures what's called a precision fill implant to reduce rippling, which means that they microfill the implant slightly more, which means it has small changes in the base width and things like that, which is a little bit of it just is, right? So they have like an 11.2 and then an 11.6, and you're like, okay, well, is it an 11 or is it 11.5?
Right. Well, I'd like to talk about kind of how we now size patients, because I think it's important that people understand how this works.
Yeah.
Right. So for me, like I said, the base width is probably the most important measurement. And so when a patient comes in, we take a bunch of measurements, but when we're looking at breast implants specifically, we measure the base width. Now, what's interesting is if you ask 10 plastic surgeons how to measure the base width, I bet you get 10 very slightly different answers.
Slightly.
Right? So, I mean, how do you see base width? What do you do when you measure that on a patient?
So the way I see base width is essentially I think about where the implant is going to go inside the breast.
Exactly.
So I try to measure, visually imagine where that implant sits.
Exactly.
And so my kind of rule of thumb is sort of the visual external width of the breast minus the pinch thickness of the breast itself, because the implant is not going to sit right up to the edge of the breast. It's going to be blocked by however thick the tissue is. So, and this comes in because I measure pinch anyway for a different reason, because I like to do subfascial hog, so I like my pinch to be over a centimeter and a half.
Which is a whole other conversation.
But I can generally say that it's like my measured base width minus 1 centimeter,
give or take. Yeah.
And I think when you look at Vectra with a 3D simulation, which we do, interestingly, for example, if there's a patient that I measure at 12, the Vectra will say 13-ish if the numbers are correct.
When you look at the assessment from where you put the landmarks.
Exactly.
But then when you look at the table of implant, it suggests
it suggests
about a
12.
centimeter to a centimeter and a half less.
Yes, it actually knows to suggest an implant that is slightly less than the base width that they have measured, which is a visual base width. How do you do it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily use the pinch thickness, but essentially it ends up being the same thing, right? I typically feel where I think the implant will sit medially and laterally, and I give generally a range of maybe no more than about 5 millimeters for what that is. So for me, it ends up being exactly the same. It ends up being about a centimeter to a centimeter and a half less than the actual true base width of the breast.
Yeah,
Or I should say maybe the footprint of the breast.
And I mean, there's some rare occasions where someone comes in and they're like already very busty. I know we said we wouldn't discuss in cup size, but C, D cup, but they're missing some upper pole fullness. You're going to place that implant a little bit higher, and so their pinch might be 2-3 centimeters.
Right.
And I try to take that a little bit into
Sure.
account, with augmentation.
And it depends on the result that they're looking for, and obviously you have to keep in mind the size of the implants and everything. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, that measurement is pretty well fixed.
Yeah, and I think that for the consumer, that's like when we ask you your, again, strap size, right? It should have, and I think that'd be a great study to do, just ask a bunch of people their strap size and their base widths and see if there's some correlate.
Well, that would be interesting.
It's an easy thing to just like try to relate and just scatter plot it.
Right.
But the reason why we don't use your strap size is because, we see breasts a lot, and every breast is different, and a breast could be very narrow, it could be very tall, it could be very wide.
That's why this is an issue, right? And trying to compare yourself to the pictures you see online are almost impossible, because you can be tall, you can be short, you can be wide chested, you can be narrow chested, you can have a wide breast, you can have a narrow breast, and sort of all of that is, it all comes into play, but it's sort of irrelevant. It's all about that base width when we come to choose an implant.
Correct.
And so, again, if you're 5'1" and you are very slight, and you're looking at someone who's 6'1" and very wide and saying, oh, I want the same implant as that person, that would look totally different on you than it would look on that other person that you're seeing online.
Right. But again, I think it's part of the way even we as a society have like manufactured this by always starting those charts with those numbers, with the things.
Right.
And so I got to say, when we're doing sizing and when I'm training my staff to sometimes come in for secondary sizing, a patient comes in, it's like, I want a 300 implant. The first thing they do is go to the chart and go to the number 300.
Right.
It's just like gut.
Well, yeah, I mean, like if two people were in conversation out in the world and they said, how big are your breast implants? They'd say, oh, they're 350 cc's. They wouldn't say they're on a 12.5 or 12.1, 12.25 centimeter base width.
Exactly.
Nobody's
like,
going to say that.
I'm a like high profile 12.5,
Exactly.
which is kind of what we want
people to start thinking about.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. I mean, so I guess like talking about the way that we do figure out the final volume, right? So based on that base width, that's where that kind of vague discussion of bra size, where you are and where you want to go, kind of comes into play, right? Because then we can start looking at the appropriate profile. So let's say that the base width is fixed, then we need to choose the right profile to get the result that someone wants.
Right.
And so, for example, all the different manufacturers have different combinations of profiles. I think, the terminology that most people are probably most familiar with are things like low profile, moderate profile, moderate plus, high, ultra high, all those things. And some of the different manufacturers call them different things, but they all mean essentially the same thing.
Yeah. And you have we talked about that triangle, right, of picking two things, and we've just basically said you don't get to pick one of them. Your base width is decided, right?
Right.
And so really you get to pick one of the other two things. So if someone comes in and says, like, I know their base width is 11.5 or 12, and they're like, I want a high profile implant. Okay, well then I'll go to the high profile. Like I know exactly the cc's.
Then this is the volume.
This is the volume that you get for that high profile.
Exactly.
And then, or some surrogates they'll use for that is like, I want to look very augmented, or I want to look, fake, or I want, and so we're going to pick a high profile implant that gets those cc's.
Right.
Or they come in with a cc, which again, I still want to hear. I want to know what their goal is.
Right.
And then I know their base width. I go where the cc is, and then I tell them their profile.
Now the nice thing is that here we use a totally different technique, though, to kind of determine the final size.
As in the size of the Vectra.
Yeah, exactly. So for people that aren't familiar, so Vectra is a device that uses a series of cameras to create a 3D model of the body, and then we can pretty accurately simulate what you're going to look like after your breast augmentation. Mm-hmm. And so we use Vectra as the primary sizing method on our practice because it allows patients to basically narrow in on exactly the size that they want.
Yeah, I mean, again, if they come in with one of those two things, like they come within a data point, most of the time it's like a size. So I know their base width, I know their size, I know what profile they're going to be at. And so then I can show them that profile, and then they can be like, oh no, that looks ridiculous, I like it a lot.
That's what I was going to ask you. How much of the time, or how many times out of 10 would you say that someone comes in and thinks they know what they want, and you show them on Vectra and they go, oh, actually different than what I was thinking.
I think when they come in with a very specific goal in mind, they're often surprised and they don't like it.
Right.
Almost universally so.
Yeah, I think that that's true. I think that people, again, and this probably gets to what they're seeing online, and that maybe that size looks good on someone else, but not on them. And when they see it on them, they say, oh, that's not actually the result I was looking for.
Right. And so I think when we start from a more kind of broad place, which is just, what are your goals? Do you want to look augmented? Do you not? Then I can kind of tailor those two data points that we can adjust, which are the profile and the size, based off of the software,
Right. Exactly.
And I've done this thing at this office, or we did, which is we basically put all implants into one table, that link all their base widths together. And, when people come in, again, if you want to really think about it, if you have a base width of whatever it is, and you look at all implant makers across the board, once you've made this table, you see that the reality is you have about 5 choices of size, and that's pretty much it.
Right.
With very tiny variations in volume based off of like the accuracy of the.
As long as you abide by our philosophy, which is to respect the native footprint of the breast.
Correct.
Right, because not every surgeon does that. Some people put in implants that are grossly wider than the breast, and over time we see the consequences of that.
Yeah, I mean the two things that I talk about the most are malposition, or your implant moving around too much, and capsular contracture. And so, I think we've both used this term like the Goldilocks fit. You want your implant to be in snugly, not too loose, not too tight, move around a little bit, not too much. And so you can imagine that no one wants a hard as a rock thing that doesn't move around and then it's too tight. And we also don't want an implant that's just flopping around all over the place when you lay down because you have no projection. Right. And so that's not an accident. That's not just like it happens. It's that you respect the footprint of the breast and you respect what's supposed to be there. And, you can go around not doing it. And then there's some ways to fuss with that to a certain extent. But
there's some variability. It's not like there's only one width that will work, but it's, it's not going to be a range of 4 centimeters.
Sure.
It might be a half to 1 centimeter or something like that.
Right. And a relatively inconsequential volume difference, which is kind of the point.
Well, that's the irony of the whole thing, right? Is you go up by 0.25 centimeters on base width, which is 2.5 millimeters, and the volume may change by 10 or 20 cc's, which is less than a tablespoon.
Exactly.
So it's those differences. Obviously they do add up if you go up several sizes, but like going one size up or down probably is largely inconsequential.
Right. But then one size up or down is, I think, another way we violate our own terminology, because what does that mean? That means one size up or down means one base width up or down for us.
I'm glad you clarified that, because, again, I'm like, it's so ingrained in my mind that when I say that it's that's exactly what I mean, like one size in base width up or down.
Correct. And for the most part, we don't really change that. When we present it to the patient, I think we say one size up means going to the next profile, fundamentally speaking.
It's funny, because when I say one size up, I'm usually actually thinking of going up one step in base width.
No, but you say like a large implant. So a small implant, large implant is all based off projection and base width. That's
exactly. So when I say, like, it's funny, right? Because when I say, when we first started working together, I'd be like, man, this is a large implant. And you're like, this is a 315. That's not a large implant. I'm like, well, it's a large implant for her because her breast is very narrow, but it's a high profile implant. And so when I think about a large or a small implant, I'm usually thinking about the projection, which is therefore the profile. And then, when I think about like going up or down a size, I'm thinking about the base width.
Sure. But I do think that there are also, like you said, factually large implants, right? I start to think about when you start to get into the 500 cc's for a primary augmentation, it's factually big. It's factually heavy.
Right.
And so, I do think that, again, the reason why someone needs an implant of that size also plays into the whole equation. And so you have to start thinking, and that's why I started saying like things like, mesh and all that other stuff. It's just that most of the time people who need an implant of that size have other anatomical considerations,
Exactly.
But yeah, I think it's a big departure from, I think for even patients, right? This is really a new way of thinking about this and making sure that it gets people the best augmentation that they can get. And a lot of people still aren't doing this.
Yeah. I mean, I think by sticking to these principles, you give people really nice natural results that also have longevity, because you don't violate some of the anatomic structures that maintain the structure of the breast.
And I'm pretty sure that there's surely great surgeons all around the country that do breast augmentation that maybe just have this in their head more like routinely.
Sure.
And, I remember I worked with a surgeon in California who, would basically come in, and he doesn't even need the tables. He did so many breast augs a week that he just had it memorized. So he'd walk in, he'd do the base width, and then hand them what is it called? Like an index card that had 3 sizes.
Right.
And what was happening right there was he was taking one brand and taking the base width and essentially knew in his head the memorized table of what the base widths were and what the implant sizes were. And so it kind of, and I would say that that's what we're saying here too, just on a more mathematical scale.
Right. Exactly.
And we use the 3D modeling to like help the patient figure it out.
And to confirm that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
This didn't end up being as controversial as I thought.
Well, that's okay.
I guess we agree. We don't agree with some other people, but we agree together.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, to me, from an anatomical standpoint and even from like an engineering standpoint, it makes sense and it's easy to think about it this way.
Yeah, it's just getting that to the end consumer so that they can understand the process.
Exactly.
Okay, well, hopefully that was helpful for people.
Yeah, I think it will be, and hopefully, somebody will listen to this and come in and say, I want a 12.5 centimeter light.
I hope so. Well, thank you everyone for joining us at another episode of Plastic Surgery Unfiltered. We're your hosts, Dr. Amado Davila and Dr. David Tur, and we'll join you next time.